And it was pretty extraordinary to behold. I think I remember that Napoleon Bonaparte was observed to be able to do 2, even 3 things at the same time. You know, concentrate, do one thing with a hand and do that with his voice and maybe something with his feet, I don't know. But at any rate, this is a fairly common story told about Napoleon. But I have certainly been present when it was obvious to me that Baba would be gesturing something to me through Irish, and he would be following something at a distance and suddenly would break off and tell a person to go make a phone call or send a telegram or something of that sort, and you find the telegram gets there just in time to do this or that or the other thing. You know, it's obvious that Baba was able to do several things at the same time. But I point out, now this is where we get into Don Stevens' lingo, and that is simply, it was our good friend Albert Einstein who pointed out that time has meaning only in relation to creation in which there are separate bodies moving in relation to each other, where there is not, if there were not separate bodies moving in relation to each other, time would not exist. It would be meaningless. All right, but what is perfection, after all? Perfection is God, which is infinite unity. There is no separation. There is no such thing as time and space in infinite perfection. It just happens to be true. And Baba says it is. Einstein completely agrees. And so you immediately see, you know, isn't it nice to have the 2 great authorities on the same side of the road? So, makes life simpler. So there we have it. You just put 2 and 2 together, and you realize, you know, Baba just has to be infinite God. There's no other way of looking at the thing. And you live around the various different things that you know about Baba and observe what he has done and so on. You come to the conclusion it's the only thing that can explain Baba, but he is infinite God. He is infinite. And in infinitude, there is no such thing as time or space. Where there's no time or space, there's no trick of the trade for the individual to do a million things in what you and I call a second. Because a second doesn't even exist. He can concentrate on Adele and the whole tribe of us and over in India and on the second planet that's supposed to have more mentality than heart, you know, and the whole system, and do all of the things that are necessary, all in less than 1 second. But what did he tell some of the people who used to come to him, want to stay on, and they would try to stay on longer than originally agreed, and Baba would finally get sort of upset with him, and he'd say, well, what do you want to stay on for? Don't you realize that Baba can do and does for you in less than the blink of one eye what is necessary for you? And you keep talking about staying on. He had no patience for it. He looked at us as if we were dimwits, you know, and we really weren't. But it was nice to be there even so. So I think we have to accept that as a fundamental fact in our daily life with Baba. So never say, I don't have the right to pour my soul out. It's bothering Baba with a lot of things that I ought to do. Sure, let's do them, but also do what he made me do. Keep in constant touch. Mine is a reporting method, as I told you last evening. And so find out what your own particular method is, but have the absolute conviction that you are a person who has been chosen by Baba himself as he is your spiritual guide. He is spiritually responsible for it. And you've got a responsibility back. Don't make him do all of the work. He didn't say, no, Don, I know all of this. Remember, he said, no. We are here in creation. You're in creation. We must observe the rules of creation. And you get in touch with me. That means I had a responsibility to do from my side. So if you don't like to go around a corner in the street and make a report to Baba, all right, you pick the other thing, another thing that is natural for you, to stay in touch with Baba. But do it in some fashion that is committed and that is regular. I mean, lots of people like to have a picture of MeherBaba. All right, is that picture of MeherBaba where you see it several times a day? And do you have an agreement with yourself to focus on the thing? Or do you just run by it and say, well, it looks so nice, and you're off to the kitchen again, or off to clean up the car, whatever it is that you've got to do? You know, do a little bit of real focusing. Open yourself out. Or if it's some sort of a prayer, even a mechanical prayer to Baba, do whatever comes naturally to you. There are 1,000 ways to do this. Baba also talks about saying the name of God, 100 times or 1,000 times a day. There's so many of these different tricks of the trade that Baba suggests to us to do this very real thing, to stay in touch with him. So, where do we go from there? Regular spontaneous contact with Baba, but I think it's better to do it spontaneously. You have to forgive me, I've got my own likes and dislikes. I sort of a little bit distrust things where you do it at the same time, the same place, every day. I like to be more intimately woven into the natural fabric of life itself. But do it. That's the terribly important thing. What about when this goes on? What do you think? Do you think that's enough? Are there some other? I think there have been a lot of different things that Baba has suggested to us. And this is high time to look at some of those and how effective they are for different people. Do some of you have your own pet ways of going about, of being in touch with Baba fairly regularly in your life, something meaningful? Fred?
I didn't want to answer that question. I remember that earlier this evening when I came in, somebody was saying, I hope Don addresses the issue of getting mad or angry with Baba.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's on your agenda.
Oh, it sure is. That's number 5.
But I thought perhaps this could be somewhat segmented into that.
All
because
right.
you're
Why
talking,
not? Let's pull this in
talking
right here.
indirectly, you know.
Because lots of times when people focus most on Baba is when life has gotten into just one hell of a mess, and one is upset, and inevitably, because one thinks one has been a good boy or a good girl, and one has tried to be open and loving with Baba and do the right things, and all of a sudden he visits this horrendous problem on me. And you know, I've known some of the most wonderful Baba lovers that I've ever known in my life who will just say, I got terribly angry with Baba last week for what he was putting me through in my life. And you know, I mean, it's heartfelt and it's honest and it's sincere. What about this? What do you think? Do you think this is just a downright failure to hold properly on to Baba's love, or is there something here we ought to be honest with each other about? What do you think? You know, and you know, this is a very real experience and a very honest description of what can go on. And it does go on a surprising number of times in the lives of people who are absolutely devoted, love Baba, and have loved him for years. But what are the realistics? I think we need to take a look at where do the tough things in our life come from? Is it Baba who makes them? Where do they come from? What do you think? Yeah.
Well, Baba says most of our suffering is self-created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He says the majority of our suffering is unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think as far as getting mad at Baba, sometimes we pay more attention to Baba when we're mad at him than when we're, like you said, there's that story in the Ramayana where the hunter out in they put the statue of Shiva in the jungle, and he was so furious that the Brahmins had come put the statue there, and he would get furious and go throw rocks at it every day. Then when he died, they took him, and Shiva intervened and said, no, he came to see me every day. And I think it's sometimes that, and sometimes I think that Baba's doing like sanskaric surgery on us. Sometimes he's speeding it up for us a little bit, and he has to anesthetize us with very strong emotions to keep us under the veil, so to speak. And it would be too much to really be cognizant of. And sometimes we just have to become aroused internally, so emotionally, so that we remain under the veil while he's like performing this sanskaric surgery, so to speak.
All right. Now, what do you think, Billy's this key statement that he makes, which is a rather arresting one, sanskaric surgery? Do you think this has got some? You all believe that?
Yeah.
Adele wants to say
like
something
that
on
very
that.
much. I think that is the essence of trying to understand what his compassionate heart is. I mean, there is no love without some kind of sacrificial thought in the love, and surrendering to that a circumstance, whatever it is. And it is, that's all that Baba does, is really that kind of samskara surgery. Constantly, because we have such a stockpile, as it were, of samskaras inherited from lower incarnations, and so.
And just day before yesterday.
Yeah, and that goes on. I mean, and the preponderance perhaps are the ones that are not balanced. I mean, you go from goodness to God, but you inherit so many that have to be transmuted and sublimated and whatnot. I just myself reached a point where my anger or my all the things that seem very antagonistic to love become very clear to me. It's not that I can overcome them like that, but I don't delude myself. I would, as much as I did. So if I were to write some results, I would say I have less self-delusion than when I first came to that.
Sure. Well, let's Nancy.
Well, you're in such a unique position that you had so much time with Baba. I would like to know if this was ever discussed with him and what was said.
Well, you know, Nancy, there were so many things that came up over the course of years, and some of them would actually be conversations for clarification of various points, especially in the discourses. And so it's very difficult for me to straighten out in my mind what I originally read in the discourse or what Baba then clarified later on so that I could understand it better. But certainly from my own personal experience with Baba when he discussed my being in the petroleum business, there it was absolutely crystal clear that where he had come directly into my life and put something into a particular pattern, it was related immediately to the samskaras of the lifetime that I was living out right now. So what Adele and what Billy said completely fits into that personal experience. Also, Baba makes it absolutely clear in all of his writings that, and this is a famous bit of verity, that in our last animal incarnation, consciousness was fully, totally developed. And from that point on, in all of the human incarnations, the only thing that is being done is nothing to do with developing more consciousness, but simply removing the samskaras, which were the byproduct of the coming to consciousness. So what Adele says when she says samskaric surgery is the whole of what Baba is doing. Baba himself simply confirms that. But then we've got to be very, very careful and go back and what is the original source of the samskaras that he is helping with surgery. Maybe we even have to look at that term surgery for a little bit. But let's go way, way back, and I'll just jump into the fray there because I've read so many things so repeatedly in both discourses, and God speaks, so different things that come from different parts finally fit together into somewhat of a logical structure. And we go back to the fundamental thing on which all of God speaks is based, and that is Baba's statement, as far as I know, for the first time in creation, that the original state of God was total unconsciousness. That shocked me totally. But innate, inherent, involved within that infinite, unified, totally unconscious God was the possibility to wish to know his divinity consciously. And then Baba puts the third thing in and says that there was the whim by which this started to move in God. And then all of creation becomes the mechanism by which this innate desire of God to know his infinite divinity consciously is brought into reality. But again, Baba points out that all of these drop souls that come up, go through the long stages of evolution through finally the animal stage, then to the human stage where all that is being done is to unwind, dissipate, unknot, make disappear the samskaras. That's what the human thing is about. And that's where the avatar comes in. But another thing that he says in all of this is, and it's another terribly clear thing that he says in another of the discourses, he says, for hundreds of thousands of human lifetimes, the whole process of individual action is almost totally mechanical. Almost totally mechanical. It is the product of the external forces and environment and the product of the internal knotted samskaras or desire patterns trying to express themselves. So what happens is the combination of these things that go on more or less mechanically. And Baba puts in another beautiful thing. If you may remember, he says, the one positive thing that the personal ego does is to act as a collecting focal point of experience. It remembers this, it remembers that, it compares them. And it compares them also with the original expectations of different actions. And so what happens gradually is that sometimes over lifetimes and lifetimes, the ego begins to say to itself, oh, I did this before, and it didn't work out well the other time, and it didn't work out well this time. And so the old ego itself starts getting disappointed with the results. Baba points out that it takes hundreds of thousands of lifetimes before the ego starts remembering this well and this clearly. And then a process starts in which the ego itself gets dissatisfied with the results. But it is the samskaras. And you know, the avatar, he hasn't entered into this particular system. When Baba talks about I made creation, this is not Baba as the avatar who is saying this is the verity. This is Baba as God. Baba as God made creation. But you know, the funny thing is you and I made creation also at that point. And when Adele was just about to start off as a drop soul through the own point where this whim is surging, there is, as it were, a decision by God Adele at that point of the particular specialized pattern of consciousness which she is going to be in charge of developing and perfecting and finally knitting back into total infinite God consciousness. And Adele consciousness will never be the same as Billy consciousness or Fred and so on and so on. So each iota of God is in charge of developing a particular pattern of consciousness. But the important thing for what we're talking about tonight is, if you stop to reflect for just a minute, now, do reflect on this, because this is absolutely vital. Everything when Adele started out on the journey as the drop soul, Adele, the whole pattern of consciousness that she used to develop, intrinsically, inherently, inevitably embodies all of the samskaras that are going to be developed and all of the karma that is going to be related. The avatar didn't manufacture that. That was involved in the original God Adele decision. In a way, yes, the avatar is involved in the decision because at that point he's God also. So he can say, I made Adele as she was, as she is. And that's true from the standpoint of the fact that the avatar is God. But I have to point out to you that Adele was God also when that decision was made and was equally responsible. So when finally the avatar gets involved in the thing is way, way, way on up beyond the animal stage in a few 100,000 lifetimes, and the ego collecting all of these things, and the Adele ego starting to get disgusted and fed up with the things, and then she finally starts getting honest. Excuse me, you've always been honest, I know, Adele. But she gets more and more honest with herself, her ego, and finally she decides that somewhere or another she's got to find a more dependable base. And somewhere along there, she begins to, what should I say, qualify for spiritual hierarchical help. And if she has been good enough, the avatar himself says, I'm going to take this gal on as my own direct responsibility, which is exactly where she is. All right. So then the avatar, as the avatar, takes on. But the avatar says to Adele, we get back to this thing that Fred liked earlier today. I saw Mayor Baba himself on repeated occasions tell individuals in great trouble, all right, okay, you're feeling through, you're having to work through your karma. Baba didn't say, I made that karma. He did not. He did not fabricate that. That was inherent, inevitable, involved in the original Adele pattern of consciousness, which she took on the responsibility to develop. And the problems associated with it were inevitably involved in that original decision. The avatar did not make that as avatar, but as God he did, but Adele as God did also. And as avatar, it's much later that he gets involved in that particular thing. So what the avatar does for us, and when he says every leaf trembles only at my will, okay, he's God at that point talking, but as the avatar, he is helping Adele by looking at the karma of Fred, how Fred fits in, and how Margaret fits in with Adele and so on, and how Adele's mother and father and brothers fit in. And so out of all of this, there is an enormous, let's say, viewing of the progressing front of life. And so Baba says, well, it'll be a darn good idea if I can get Fred to do that because it fits his karma, and I can get Margaret to do that because it fits Margaret's karma, and they can both fit in with Adele. And if that happens, Adele will see very clearly this part of Adele's karma. And so Baba arranges scenarios, of course, but he doesn't manufacture our problem. That we've absolutely got to be clear in our own minds. So if a person says, I got mad at Baba for what he put me through, all right, let's pull that apart. Okay, what I have to go through is my own blessed karma that was involved right from the start in my own drop soul consciousness. So, but he does some very clever arranging of scenario to put it as clearly and as rapidly as possible. So if you want to get mad at him for putting it so clearly. And sometimes speeding it up. That he also does. Remember, he says that himself. When you merit a great master, you have the choice either of accepting him and the inevitable speeding up of the living through of your karma, your samskaras, or saying, no, I want to do it all myself. That's the essential decision. Does this make any sense? I think it's so terribly important to really, really see clearly where the avatar is responsible and where, by God, it was me and God and the avatar, because we were all God who did it at that particular point.
Can you say something? Are you going to say anything about free will at all?
Well, it certainly gets involved, but you were going to say something just before, weren't you?
Well, I was going to say this is really interesting because
I think it's fascinating, isn't
I
it?
haven't, I've never gotten mad at Baba, but I get dang mad at that wimp. I get really mad at that.
You're real old-fashioned, aren't you?
I mean, I get really frustrated with the rules of the game.
But you know, I have to point out to you, as Baba points out to you, he knows himself as God. You are God, but you just don't know. And those decisions were yours, too. You and I were equally involved at the very beginning of all of this thing as God, in the way in which this was all put together, and the way the rules of the universe. Baba says, I made the rules of the universe, but he made them as God. And you were God at that point, too. So let's not blame it all on him. Let's take our own part of our responsibility. Take it on our own blessed shoulders. We are responsible. Let's see. No.
I was wrong all this time. I was always complaining about it.
But
It's
you
his
can't.
idea.
You
I said it was
can't.
your
It's
idea
not
to
true.
have this. I'm wrong.
It's not true. You were just blessed wrong, Candy. Yeah.
What about free will?
Yeah, but somebody else had their hand up. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, Aditya Rani said something that I remember from a long time ago. He says, you can get angry with Baba like a child, but then you must go and ask for forgiveness like a child. And
because he's not to blame. You've got to be honest with yourself. That's the reason you've got to do it. It's not fair. You're pointing it in the wrong direction. Baba says all of these things, but you just have to put them together from the different places that he salts them away. Okay, we've got the ego here. And we already got to the point where the ego was beginning to be a bit disturbed by what the ego remembered, compared, and judged how this action worked out in relation to my previous expectations. And the ego itself begins to get more and more and more fed up. And first thing that the ego obviously does, you're all familiar with that, it says, by God, that thing didn't work out because Adele, bless her height, she crossed me up right in the middle, and she went out of control, and so the whole thing was flummoxed. So obviously, the next time we try it, I've got to get Adele under control. So I put a great big plan. You know, this is the way we work. It's exactly what happens. The Father says this is terribly important to see what happens. So I try to get Adele under control the next time. And you know, I butter her up and I invite her to tea and nice lovely things, and I propagandize her, get her all under control, and the thing starts working out, and I think, oh boy, this is going to be marvelous this time. The only blessed trouble is that unfortunately we have a thunderstorm right in the middle of the whole thing, and everything gets flummoxed. Adele is just as mad about that as I am, that this project hasn't worked out. So how am I going to control a thunderstorm? You know? And there are all these different pertinent things in an environment that go out of control. And you've seen people who try to get people and circumstances under control, and they become nervous wrecks, you know, pretty soon. There's some manipulation, manipulating and controlling life, and above all, controlling other human beings. And by God, that is one of the worst things you can become involved in, trying to control another human being for your own pleasure, quite frankly. But one gets involved in it. But finally, one begins to have, maybe it takes another 100,000 lifetimes for this penny to drop. Finally, you begin to see there just ain't no way to get everything under control. So then the ego has a real crisis on its hands. How am I going to be satisfied is what the ego asks itself. And so then maybe the ego does an extraordinary leap of intuition and says, maybe there is some other source of control or truth or satisfaction that I don't know about. And so it might even say, let's go to the library and start reading up on philosophy. So how many people do that, you know, as their first step? Or psychology. They say psychology, that's my answer, because obvious my emotions are all at 6 and 7. So one has all of these pet ideas as to what one might study or do to get the thing more dependable, so the ego can be happy and satisfied with the results. Because the ego's looking for satisfaction. But eventually, you know, the ego tries this and it tries that, and it becomes erudite, and it tries to become loving, and so on. And finally, it begins to suspect that maybe the answer lies outside of this thing that I call myself. And so it starts knocking on doors and looking around, and it finds there are all sorts of theories about this sort of thing. And little by little, the individual is pushed to start becoming honest. And actually, sit around and think about the subject of honesty. You know, in addition to don't worry, be happy, the other thing I think that Baba has pushed upon most everywhere is the necessity for honesty. Because this is the greatest sword, finally, for killing the ego. So, at any rate, what happens in all of this? Little by little, we jump on the individual that begins to have some spiritual help and guidance, and as he does, then gradually some of the toughest problems begin to be working out, and the manner in which they work out, and the results are rather extraordinary. And what happens? I can tell you this because I've done it in 1 or 2 little places in my life, somewhere where I always had to do it this way or that way, or I'd get mad or upset or feel horrible. Instead, I do my best. I do try really to do a good job. I try to do what is necessary, and if it works out, that's absolutely marvelous. If it doesn't work out, well, it can't be done. We move on to the next thing. But the thing that is terribly interesting in all of this is that when I am in a situation which demands decision, instead of allowing a great rush of automatic habit pattern or emotion to control automatically the situation, I'm suspicious, or better still, I refer to Baba, and I focus my consciousness on Baba, and what happens? Sanskaric energy is halted in its path at that moment. And Sanskaric energy is no longer automatically shunted out over there. So as soon as I find a method which is deep and sincere and efficacious, and concentrating on the avatar is by concentrating on truth. But Baba is the one that we know. But any concentration on truth will stop the samskaric energy from immediate automatic expression, and it's free energy. Well, what is that but free will? Samskaric energy, which is not allowed automatically to flow into some pattern. Now, many times, really, you're kidding yourself, because finally when you decide to go ahead, it's still controlled by your old samskara, which isn't completely worn out. But I will tell you this, not all of it is controlled by that samskaric pattern. There is a part of that energy that has been freed up. And increasingly, as you go on, there is more and more of it that is freed up. And what else can you call that but free will? I think it's fascinating what Baba sketches out for us. This is all involved directly from what Baba tells us about the nature of samskaras, the nature of the ego, and the nature of the role of the avatar, the great master in our lives. Free will is innate in that. Baba said, of course, that my karma has to be worked out. And he says, but I made the rules for creation. All right, but remember, he made those rules for creation as God. The avatar as God made the rules for creation, because the avatar had not even become the avatar when that was all set up. But it's absolutely right to say, I made them, but as God. Okay, so where were we? Yes, the shoulders. Okay, so along comes Don with all of his karma, and finally he meets the avatar, and everything is going along, and he's helping me out with these scenarios. And he's really helping and standing by me, and I get into a great big mess. And I say to Baba, good heavens, Baba, this is absolutely terrible. I don't know if I've got the strength and the willpower to live this one through. I'm really tired out. And so Baba looks at me and he says, Don, because of your love for me, I will take this part of your karma from your head, and I will lower it to your shoulders, but I will not eliminate it, because I made the laws of creation, and I will not unmake the laws that I myself made. And this is the way he explained it again and again. It simply means that we are responsible, but he will help us to a certain degree. By his magic, he has those powers, but he will not unmake and magically make disappear in my life. Does it?